My family called a formal meeting on a Tuesday evening to announce they were stealing $100,000 from me. They preferred the term reallocating. The money was a trust fund left by my grandfather, explicitly earmarked for my first home down payment. In Washington state, owning property is not just about having a place to live. It is the ultimate metric of self-reliance and success. My grandfather respected financial independence above all else and structured the trust, so my parents acted as executors, releasing the funds only when my sister and I were ready to buy our first homes. I was 8 months pregnant at the time, sitting across from them in their pristine dining room. They were taking my secure future to hand it to my older sister, Vanessa. Vanessa had already received her $100,000 5 years ago. She used it to buy a suburban home with her husband. But 8 months before this meeting, she decided domestic life was suffocating. She walked away from her husband, abandoned her 2 toddlers, and moved into a rented downtown loft with a man named Chase. Chase traded cryptocurrency, despised traditional employment, and spoke mostly in buzzwords. Now their lease was ending, the crypto market had cooled, and Vanessa decided she needed a luxury waterfront condo in Bellevue to maintain her new lifestyle. Because her own trust fund was gone, my parents decided to take mine. They expected me to cry. They wanted me to throw a hormonal fit so they could label me unreasonable and justify the theft. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply looked at my father and said I would agree to the transfer on one specific condition. The smug satisfaction drained from his face the moment the words left my mouth. Before I take you back to that dining room and tell you exactly what I demanded, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Still Drama Stories. Drop a comment and tell me how old you are and where you are watching from today. I love reading your responses. Now let me bring you into that room. My name is Sloane Sterling. I am 30 years old and I work as a data scientist for a major tech firm in Seattle. My job is to evaluate risk-clean datasets and build predictive models based on historical behavior. People are just variables to me. If you watch them long enough, their patterns become undeniable. My parents, Richard and Diane, operated on a very specific pattern. Whatever Vanessa wanted, Vanessa got. I was simply expected to balance the ledger. It was raining that afternoon. The steady gray drizzle of the Pacific Northwest made the house feel like a sealed vault. I sat at the mahogany dining table, resting my hands lightly on the swell of my stomach. My father sat at the head of the table with a manila folder. My mother sat adjacent to him, holding her teacup with both hands, wearing a practiced look of sympathy. We called this meeting because we need to discuss a reallocation, my father said. He adjusted his glasses. He always used corporate terminology to sanitize his betrayals. Optimization, adjustment, reallocation. Vanessa is in a transitional phase, my mother added. She let out a soft, rehearsed sigh. She is trying to build a new life, Sloane. The real estate market is unforgiving right now. She needs stability. She had stability, I pointed out. My voice was level. She left it. My father tapped the manila folder. This is not about the past. It is about securing a future. Vanessa and Chase have found a beautiful unit in Bellevue. They are short on the down payment. We looked at the accounts and we took a vote. 2 executors, 1 absent favorite child, and the pregnant daughter sitting across from them. We are transferring the remaining $100,000 to Vanessa tomorrow morning, he concluded. I did not blink. I felt the familiar, cold calculus click into place behind my eyes. I knew their strategy. If I argued, my father would call me ungrateful. They thrived on emotional friction because it distracted from the math of what they were actually doing. I see, I said. My mother leaned forward, her brow furrowed in faux concern. You have a great job, sweetheart. You are single and capable. You do not need a house right this second. An apartment is perfectly fine for a new baby. Vanessa is struggling. Family helps family. I cataloged her pristine manicure and her cashmere sweater. My parents harbored a desperate need to keep Vanessa looking respectable to their country club friends. They could not bear the social embarrassment of their golden child failing. They were funding her illusion with my grandfather's money to protect their own image. You are taking the trust established for my first home while I am 8 months pregnant to buy a condo for a man who does not work, I summarized. It is for your sister, my father corrected. His tone hardened. And as executors, we have the legal discretion to distribute the funds as we see fit for the family's overall well-being. The decision is made, Sloane. He leaned back and waited for the explosion. The air in the dining room grew thick. I took a slow breath and felt my daughter kick against my ribs. I thought about the spreadsheets I build. I thought about the algorithms that find the single point of failure in a complex system. My parents thought they held all the leverage. They thought my silence was shock. It was processing time. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany. "Fine," I said. My father raised his eyebrows. My mother halted her teacup halfway to her mouth. "Fine," my father echoed. Suspicion crept into his boardroom voice. "You are the executors," I stated. "If you determine Vanessa requires the capital to secure her Bellevue property, I will not contest the transfer." A radiant smile broke across my mother's face. She had expected a war. "Oh, Sloan, thank you. You do not know how much this means to her, to us. You have always been the sensible one." "I am agreeing to the transfer." I continued ignoring her praise. "On one specific condition." The smiles vanished. The room went still. Outside, the rain drummed against the window pane in a rhythmic and indifferent sound. "What condition?" my father asked. His hands flattened against the folder. He was already bracing for a financial demand. A promise of repayment or a slice of their estate. He understood transactions. I opened my leather tote bag. Data scientists do not just predict trends. We prepare for them. I reached inside and pulled out a single neatly printed document. "A signature," I said. I watched them stare at the paper in my hand. They had no idea what was written on it, and they had no idea that signing it would dismantle the rest of their lives. I slid the single sheet of premium linen paper across the polished mahogany surface. It came to rest exactly between my father's manila folder and my mother's floral teacup. In the Pacific Northwest specifically, within the sprawling shadow of the Seattle tech ecosystem, real power does not announce itself with raised voices or theatrical tears. It is a culture built on quiet pragmatism and intense self-reliance. True leverage here lies in accumulated equity-restricted stock units and legally binding agreements. People in my industry do not throw glasses against walls when they are betrayed by business partners or family members. We draft contracts. We insulate our assets. We neutralize the variable before it can compromise the structural integrity of our lives. My parents still operated on an older and much louder frequency. They preferred the superficial optics of rescuing a damsel in distress. My older sister was their eternal damsel. To understand the specific gravity of the document now sitting on the dining table, you have to understand the chaotic variable that is Vanessa. She did not just stumble into hard times through bad luck. 5 years ago, she possessed a stable life in a quiet suburb with her husband Mark, a reliable structural engineer, and their 2 toddlers. But suburban stability bored her. 8 months prior to this meeting, she decided that being a mother in a cul-de-sac was stifling her potential. She packed 3 suitcases, left the children with Mark without a backward glance, and moved into a rented downtown loft with a man named Chase. Chase did not believe in traditional employment or steady paychecks. He traded volatile cryptocurrency, leased a luxury electric vehicle he had no means to charge at his own building, and spoke exclusively in empty tech buzzwords about disrupting the market. Now their lease was expiring. The crypto market had predictably cooled, and Vanessa saw her illusion of high society fracturing. She needed a premium waterfront condo in Bellevue to maintain her curated social media presence. More importantly, she needed my grandfather's trust fund to secure the keys. The local real estate market is famously unforgiving, demanding fierce capital, spotless financial histories, and unyielding credit. Vanessa possessed none of these things. My life offered a stark contrast. As a data scientist, my days consist of evaluating risk-cleaning corrupted datasets and building predictive models. I live a quiet and highly organized existence. I never ask my parents for loans. I never need them to co-sign my decisions or bail me out of careless mistakes. This financial independence, rather than earning their respect, fostered a deep and simmering resentment. By requiring nothing from them, I rendered their parental authority obsolete. Vanessa's chaos gave them a purpose. By sacrificing my financial foundation to fund her latest mistake, they were reasserting their control over the family dynamic and proving they still held the reins. My father reached into his breast pocket and withdrew his silver reading glasses. He slipped them on, staring down at the paper I had provided. "What is this, Sloan?" he asked. A familiar edge of condescension crept into his throat. "Another one of your spreadsheets." "It is a financial severance and liability transfer," I said. I kept my voice as level as a metronome. If you want my authorization to release those funds to Vanessa by tomorrow morning, you will both sign it." My mother let out a sharp and impatient breath. She tapped her manicured fingers against her teacup, signaling her growing irritation. "Sloan, we do not have time for petty games. The wire deadline is strict. Vanessa is waiting to hear from us." "It is not a game," I replied. I maintained unbroken eye contact with my father. "It is a trade. You are asking me to forfeit a six-figure asset intended for my growing family to subsidize her lavish lifestyle. I am willing to step aside, but in exchange I require a permanent legal boundary." My father picked up the document. His eyes scanned the text, but I could tell by the rhythmic jumping of his gaze that he was merely skimming. He was a man who relied on charm and intimidation, assuming the fine print was beneath his notice. "Let me summarize it for you to save time," I offered. I leaned back slightly as my daughter shifted against my ribs. Clause A acknowledges that I am voluntarily relinquishing all current and future claims to the Sterling Family Trust. Clause B stipulates that by redirecting these funds, you and Mom assume sole and exclusive financial responsibility for Vanessa's future endeavors. My father scoffed. He let out a short breath of pure arrogance. "We are her parents. We look out for her. We do not need a contract to tell us that." Clause C is the crucial one I continued, deliberately ignoring his interruption. It explicitly indemnifies me against any and all future financial obligations toward this family. It severs any expectation of fiduciary duty on my part. When you sign that paper, you agree that I will never be asked to co-sign a loan, cover a mortgage deficit fund, an emergency bailout, or pay for your future elder care and medical expenses. I am permanently closing my ledger with this household today. The dining room fell into a heavy and suffocating silence. The rain outside picked up drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass. My mother looked at my father, her brow pinched in genuine confusion. "Elder care," she repeated. "Sloan, what a morbid and ridiculous thing to put on paper. We are fine. Your father's consulting business is doing wonderful." It was not doing wonderful. My predictive models did not just apply to tech startups and market trends. They applied to human behavior and domestic spending habits. I had seen the subtle shifts in their lifestyle over the past year. The delayed landscaping maintenance, the transition from premium wines to mid-tier labels, the frantic energy my father carried when discussing interest rates and property taxes. They were over-leveraged. They were trying to maintain a flawless facade of wealth in a region where actual wealth quietly outpaced them every single day. I knew the exact trajectory of their finances, and the line graph always pointed downward. "If you are fine, then signing the document carries zero risk," I pointed out clinically. "You get the money for the Bellevue condo right now, I get my perimeter forever." My father took off his glasses and tossed them onto his folder. He looked at me, not as a daughter, but as a nuisance standing in his way. He viewed my contract as a dramatic tantrum from a bitter and pregnant woman who felt slighted by a family vote. He could not fathom that the paper in front of him was a meticulously crafted legal trap. "You have always been so cold, Sloan," he murmured. He shook his head and unclipped the silver pen from his shirt pocket. "If a piece of paper makes you feel better about helping your own sister, fine. We will play your little game." He clicked the pen. He did not read the dense and heavily researched legal statutes cited in the third paragraph. He did not notice the specific Washington state codes regarding indemnification and familial debt relinquishment. He just wanted the swift victory of putting me in my place. He pressed the pen to the signature line and signed his name with a harsh and sweeping flourish. He slid the paper toward my mother. "Sign it, Diane. Let us get this over with so I can call the bank." My mother hesitated for a fraction of a second. She looked at my calm and unreadable face. Perhaps a tiny instinct warned her that I was conceding too easily. But the allure of calling Vanessa with good news overwhelmed her brief caution. She quickly scribbled her signature next to his, sealing the agreement. I picked up the document. I checked the ink, ensuring both signatures were clear and legally binding. I neatly folded the paper and slid it back into my leather tote bag. The physical weight of the transaction settling into place brought a profound clarity to my mind. "Thank you," I said. I stood up and smoothed my maternity coat over my stomach. "We will let you know when the wire clears," my father said. He was already turning his attention back to his phone, dismissing me entirely from his reality. "Try to be happy for your sister Sloan. She deserves a fresh start." I did not offer a parting pleasantry. I simply turned and walked out of the dining room. I moved down the long hallway toward the front door. The house felt smaller than it had when I arrived. It felt hollow and fragile. I stepped out onto the covered porch and pulled my collar up against the damp and biting chill of the Seattle afternoon. The scent of wet pine needles and cold asphalt filled my lungs. I walked down the long driveway to my understated sedan. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The quiet isolation of the car enveloped me, blocking out the noise of my family. I did not start the engine right away. I took a deep breath. I let the tension of the last hour drain out of my shoulders. The severance was complete. They had chosen their path, and I had ensured their reckless choices would never again bleed into my bank accounts. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dim interior of the car. I bypassed my unread text messages and tapped the icon for my secure real estate portal. The application loaded and requested my biometric verification. A second later, the dashboard appeared. The progress bar that had been hovering near the finish line for weeks was gone. I refreshed the page to ensure the data was current. The screen updated, displaying a crisp green checkmark and a bold string of text. Escrow status closed. Title recorded. Congratulations on your new property. My parents were currently celebrating the theft of a down payment I had not needed for over 6 months. My restricted stock units had vested, and my future was already secure. The timeline accelerated the moment I drove away from their house. By 9 o'clock the following morning, Richard and Diane marched into their local bank branch. They authorized the wire transfer, moving $100,000 into Vanessa's checking account. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how they behaved. My father likely wore his best suit to sign the authorization forms, projecting the image of a benevolent patriarch securing his legacy. My mother likely chatted with the teller, dropping casual hints about how they were rescuing their eldest daughter from a housing crisis. They were celebrating their triumph. They had successfully reasserted their dominance over the family hierarchy. In their minds, my capitulation the previous afternoon was merely the first phase of my defeat. They expected the reality of my situation to hit me within 48 hours. The Pacific Northwest real estate market is famously unforgiving. Bidding wars are routine. Cash offers are the baseline. Starter homes command astronomical prices, and the barrier to entry requires ironclad capital. They assumed I was still renting a cramped apartment in a loud neighborhood. They calculated that a single pregnant woman stripped of her trust fund would inevitably face an impossible future. They anticipated that I would come crawling back to them by the end of the week, desperate and humbled, begging for a high-interest private loan. The campaign of emotional manipulation began on Thursday. It started with text messages, but quickly escalated to voicemails when I refused to type a response. My phone would light up with my mother's contact photo, followed by a deposited audio file. I listened to them while sitting at my desk, analyzing her vocal patterns. Diane perfected a tone of sorrowful concern, weaponizing her maternal worry. She left messages asking how I was holding up, sighing into the receiver, and lamenting how difficult it must be for me to face the prospect of bringing a newborn into a rented apartment. She offered to let me move back into my childhood bedroom, framing the ultimate surrender of my independence as a generous favor. When my mother failed to elicit a response, my father took over. His voicemails carried a different frequency. Richard did not pretend to be sad. He projected authority and impatience. In one specific recording left on a Friday afternoon, the underlying tension was palpable. Behind his gruff instructions for me to call him back, I heard a distinct rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of his heavy brass pen striking his oak desk. I knew that sound intimately. It was the physical manifestation of his impatience for submission. He was sitting in his home office, staring at his phone, waiting for the prodigal daughter to crack. He expected tears. He expected a plea for financial salvation. I provided nothing. Instead of engaging with their manufactured drama, I retreated into the quiet sanctuary of my data and my work. My silence was not a defense mechanism. It was a strategic deployment of absence. I went to the tech campus every morning, swiped my badge, and immersed myself in predictive modeling. The glass and steel architecture of my office served as a fortress against their archaic familial politics. My parents' fundamental error was measuring my wealth by their own outdated metrics. They believed the grandfathered trust fund was my only path to homeownership. They did not understand the modern compensation structures of the Seattle technology sector. 4 years ago, I accepted a position at a mid-stage data analytics firm. My compensation package included a substantial allocation of restricted stock units. I spent years working grueling hours optimizing algorithms and driving product development. When the company went public, my shares vested. I did not broadcast my windfall. While Vanessa posted every minor luxury purchase on social media, I quietly partnered with a fiduciary. I routed the vested shares into a diversified portfolio and a dedicated real estate trust. I secured my financial independence months before my parents ever called their family meeting. The $100,000 they stole was a rounding error compared to the equity I had silently built. I bypassed their control entirely, constructing a financial perimeter so thick they could not even see the walls. While I optimized my maternal leave schedule and finalized the nursery in my new home, the overarching tension shifted across Lake Washington. I did not need a direct line to Vanessa to predict her next moves. Her behavior was a fixed algorithm. The wire transfer had cleared, and the money was now in her possession. Rather than using the funds responsibly to secure a modest townhouse or stabilize her chaotic life, Vanessa plunged into a state of profound delusion. She began touring premium waterfront properties in Bellevue. She dragged real estate agents through high-rise units featuring floor-to-ceiling glass panoramic views of the Seattle skyline and chef kitchens imported from Italy. She was shopping for properties listed well over $2 million, armed with a down payment that would barely cover the closing costs and property taxes of such an estate. She operated under the false assumption that having 6 figures in a checking account granted her infinite purchasing power. She was wholly out of touch with mathematical reality, treating the stolen money like a limitless black card. Chase encouraged this detachment from reality. He accompanied her to the viewings, critiquing the amenities and complaining about the lack of dedicated electric vehicle charging stations. He viewed Vanessa's sudden influx of cash as his own personal venture capital. He fed her ego, promising her that his next cryptocurrency trade would easily cover the exorbitant monthly mortgage payments. Vanessa absorbed his empty promises, desperate to mold her life into the flawless aesthetic he demanded. The situation fractured further during a private meeting with a luxury mortgage broker. The broker reviewed their combined income, noted Chase's lack of verifiable employment, and flagged Vanessa's dismal credit history. The reality of the Seattle housing market collided with their fantasy. The broker informed them that $100,000 was insufficient for the properties they wanted. This rejection sparked a fierce dispute between Vanessa and Chase. As they sat in their rented loft surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, the dynamic shifted. Chase did not offer to find a traditional job to support their application. Instead, he deflected the blame onto Vanessa. He claimed the broker was biased and that the only way to bypass the strict underwriting process was to present a united and formidable front. Then he delivered his ultimatum. Chase demanded that his name be added to the property deed of whatever home they eventually purchased. He contributed nothing to the down payment. He offered zero capital and carried negative credit. Yet he framed his demand as a test of her loyalty. He argued that if they were true partners building a disrupted modern life, his name needed to be on the title. Vanessa hesitated, sensing the inherent danger of giving a man she had known for 8 months legal ownership of an asset funded by her family. But Chase deployed the silent treatment. He packed a duffel bag and threatened to leave her alone in the loft, hinting that he could easily find a partner who truly believed in his vision. The threat of abandonment paralyzed her. Vanessa had already destroyed her marriage and alienated her children to be with him. If Chase left, her entire narrative of pursuing a better and more authentic life would collapse. She would be exposed as a fool to our parents and her social circle. Desperate for his approval and terrified of public failure, Vanessa caved. She promised Chase that his name would go on the deed no matter what it took to secure the mortgage. She agreed to tether her legal and financial future to a man who viewed her solely as a funding source. The trap she was building for herself was far more dangerous than the one I had left behind in my parents' dining room. The absence of a reaction is often the most profound reaction you can deliver. My sustained silence over the following week did not just frustrate my parents, it dismantled their sense of authority. Richard spent his entire adult life operating a boutique corporate consulting firm in Bellevue, a role that conditioned him to expect immediate compliance. When he sent an email, subordinates replied within minutes. When he left a voicemail, clients returned his call before the end of the business day. By ignoring his digital provocations, I was not merely brushing off a concerned parent. I was actively challenging his position at the top of the familial hierarchy. He realized that holding my down payment hostage had failed to produce the desperate weeping daughter he required to validate his ego. Since withholding funds did not force me into submission, my father decided to manufacture a crisis that would. He calculated that a pregnant woman facing sudden homelessness would have no choice but to seek refuge under his roof. If I moved back into my childhood bedroom, I would be back under his direct control, subject to his rules, and forced to witness Vanessa receive the financial glory I had surrendered. To execute this trap, he reverted to the tactics that built his consulting career. He utilized his local network. Richard belonged to an exclusive golf club, a place where older Seattle businessmen traded favors, shared insider information, and leveraged their connections to bypass standard procedures. He knew the general neighborhood where I lived, having visited my ground floor apartment exactly once for a brief obligatory dinner 2 years ago. Using his real estate contacts, he pulled the public records for the address, tracking down the specific property management group that handled the building. He assumed I was a standard tenant, bound by a standard lease, vulnerable to standard bureaucratic interference. Armed with the contact information for the property management office, my father made his move. He placed a call pretending to act as my authorized representative. He cited fabricated financial hardships, likely leaning heavily into the narrative that his daughter was a single struggling mother-to-be who could no longer sustain the monthly rent. He requested an immediate termination of the lease agreement, hoping to trigger a sudden eviction notice. He wanted the property manager to serve me with 30 days to vacate, thereby placing me in an impossible situation just weeks before my due date. I was sitting at my desk on the tech campus when the initial automated alert crossed my screen. My workspace consisted of 3 monitors displaying active code predictive algorithms and historical data models. I did not view the notification as a personal attack. I viewed it through the clinical lens of my profession. My father was no longer just an annoying relative. He was a compromised variable acting with hostile intent within my ecosystem. When a variable turns hostile, you do not cry over its betrayal. You isolate it, you observe its behavior, and you allow it to exhaust its resources against your defenses. My phone vibrated on the desk. A new voicemail had arrived from Richard. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, shutting out the hum of the open plan office, and pressed play. His voice lacked the booming performative anger he usually deployed. Instead, it carried a sickeningly smooth, smug satisfaction. "Sloan," he began, letting a heavy sigh filter through the microphone. "I have been thinking about your situation. The Seattle rental market is incredibly volatile right now. Landlords are raising rates, terminating leases, and looking for more stable tenants. I am hearing whispers that your building management might be making some sudden administrative changes. You need to be realistic about your future. You are about to have a baby, and you cannot afford to be caught off guard. You might want to start packing your bags just in case. Your mother prepared your old room. The door is open when you are ready to stop being stubborn." He ended the call. He thought he had executed a masterstroke. He believed he had cornered me into a position of total dependency. He painted himself as the prophetic savior, offering shelter from a storm he had personally seeded. I saved the audio file to an encrypted external drive. I kept a meticulous record of every interaction, building a comprehensive dataset of their manipulation. This was not born out of paranoia. It was born from a fundamental understanding that toxic people eventually hang themselves if you provide them with enough rope. I returned to my coding environment, my heart rate steady, my breathing deep and measured. I felt my daughter move a strong, reassuring flutter, and I placed a hand over my stomach. I promised her she would never know the kind of conditional love that required a signature and a surrendered dignity. 30 minutes later, my phone illuminated again. This time, the incoming call display showed the name David. David was the senior portfolio manager at a boutique property management firm in the city. I stepped away from my desk, walking toward the soundproof glass pods designed for private corporate calls. I slid the glass door shut, sealing myself in a quiet cube overlooking the Seattle skyline. I answered on the second ring. "Hello, David." "Sloan, I apologize for interrupting your workday," David said. His tone was professional but edged with unmistakable confusion. "We just experienced a highly unusual situation at the office, and I felt it was necessary to bring it to your attention immediately." I stood by the window watching the ferry boats cut across the gray waters of the Puget Sound. "Go ahead. We received a phone call regarding Unit A at the Queen Anne property, David explained. An older gentleman contacted our front desk. He claimed to be your father and stated he had your express permission to terminate the lease agreement early. He insisted that you were facing severe financial insolvency and needed to vacate the premises before the end of the month to avoid eviction proceedings. He was very forceful, demanding we draft the termination paperwork and send it to his email address for a signature. David paused clearly, struggling to reconcile the bizarre phone call with the reality of his ledger. "How did your staff respond?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "My front desk agent was very confused," David continued. "She placed him on hold and came directly to my office. We obviously did not process any paperwork, nor did we confirm any of your details with him. I took the liberty of telling him that we could not discuss tenant information with unauthorized third parties, and I ended the call. I wanted to alert you in case you are dealing with a case of identity theft or some sort of familial dispute. I appreciate your discretion, David," I said. "You handled it exactly as you should have." There was a brief silence on the line. David cleared his throat. "Sloan the man was insisting we evict you. I did not know how to tell him that we cannot terminate your lease because you do not have a lease." "That is correct," I affirmed. "You do not rent Unit A." David said, his confusion giving way to a shared realization of the absurdity. "No, David, I do not rent Unit A," I replied softly, allowing a rare, faint smile to touch my lips. My parents spent their entire lives evaluating success by external optics. They assumed my quiet lifestyle meant I was struggling. They assumed my lack of flashy purchases meant I lacked capital. They did not understand that true wealth in the tech industry is silent. Years ago, when my initial stock units vested, I did not buy a luxury vehicle or upgrade my wardrobe. I secured a commercial loan and purchased the entire 4-unit townhouse building in the Queen Anne neighborhood. I lived in the ground floor unit, and David's firm managed the other 3 units, generating a steady stream of passive income that covered my own living expenses entirely. My father had just spent his morning trying to convince a property manager to evict the landlord. I spent the weekend configuring the environmental sensors in the nursery of my primary residence. The room was a study in controlled variables. I painted the walls a soft slate gray, installed a smart bassinet that tracked heart rate and oxygen levels, and programmed a localized air filtration system to run on a precise schedule. To me, data equals safety. Every metric I could monitor provided a reliable layer of insulation against the unpredictable nature of the world. I found profound comfort in numbers, knowing that mathematics do not lie, manipulate, or harbor hidden agendas. While I calibrated the humidity threshold on my tablet, enjoying the deep quiet of my secure home, a very different kind of calibration was failing across the water in Bellevue. Vanessa sat in a sleek glass office alongside Chase. The luxury mortgage broker sat across from them, folding his hands over a pristine desk before sliding a printed denial letter in their direction. The stolen $100,000 sat in her checking account, but it was practically useless. Bellevue waterfront properties demand flawless financial histories, extensive cash reserves, and verifiable consistent income. Vanessa possessed a credit score ruined by unpaid credit cards from her recent separation and custody battles. Chase possessed zero taxable income, relying entirely on volatile digital assets that conservative underwriters refused to acknowledge as legitimate liquidity. The broker explained in plain, unforgiving terms that a luxury condo required a stringent debt-to-income ratio. They failed every required metric. The math was definitive. Vanessa did not reflect on her poor choices. She did not consider downsizing to a reasonable property. She panicked. She walked out to the parking garage, sat inside Chase's leased electric vehicle, and dialed our parents. The tears began before my father even answered the phone. She weaponized her distress, sobbing that the bank was stealing her dream, that the broker was biased against modern entrepreneurs, and that they were going to end up homeless. She expertly painted herself as a victim of a rigid corporate system that failed to recognize their brilliance. She knew exactly which buttons to push to activate our parents' savior complex. Richard and Diane sat in their living room listening on speakerphone. The cold reality washed over them like winter rain. Sacrificing my trust fund had not solved the problem. The stolen capital was insufficient. To secure the luxury condo, Vanessa needed a guarantor. She needed someone with pristine credit and substantial equity to assume the debt. She needed them to co-sign the mortgage. My father was a consultant who understood risk. He knew that attaching his name to a seven-figure loan for an unemployed couple was financial suicide. He paced the hardwood floor, rubbing his temples in agitation. My mother twisted her wedding band, her mind racing through the terrifying social implications. They were scheduled to attend a prestigious charity gala at their country club that very weekend. Their entire social currency relied on the carefully maintained illusion of a perfect, highly successful family. If Vanessa failed to secure the condo, if she ended up living in a low-income rental or sleeping in their guest room, the gossip would be inescapable. Their peers would whisper about the golden child falling from grace, casting judgment over cocktails and tennis matches. The cultural pressure of the wealthy Seattle suburbs is a silent, crushing weight. For Richard and Diane, maintaining appearances was vastly more important than maintaining solvency. The thought of facing their friends with a failed daughter was worse than facing a debt collector. In the world of data science, we refer to this as a cascading failure. It occurs when one initial error triggers a sequence of subsequent errors, amplifying the damage at every stage until the entire system collapses. My parents were initiating a cascading failure. They were applying a short-term emotional patch to a long-term structural deficit. They operated on the assumption that wealth is a static image you project to the world rather than a dynamic metric you must actively manage and protect. By prioritizing optics over analytics, they blinded themselves to the inevitable outcome. They were willingly walking onto a minefield simply because the grass looked greener on the other side. To justify taking on such a perilous financial burden, they needed to manufacture a villain. They could not blame Vanessa, and they certainly could not blame their own enabling behavior. So they blamed me. Sitting in their immaculate living room, they convinced each other that I was the root cause of this crisis. They reasoned that if I had simply liquidated some of my tech stocks, if I had contributed my salary to a family pool without asking for binding contracts, they would not be forced to take this risk. My quiet independence was reframed as extreme selfishness. I became the antagonist in their shared delusion, which made their reckless decision feel like a noble and necessary sacrifice. Richard contacted his mortgage broker that afternoon. He offered his own extensive financial portfolio to back the loan. But the underwriting requirements for the premium Bellevue property were exceptionally steep. A simple signature was not enough to offset Vanessa and Chase's immense liabilities. The bank required tangible collateral to secure a loan of that magnitude. My parents owned a sprawling, fully paid-off home in a prestigious neighborhood. It was their sanctuary and their primary retirement asset. To push the condo application through underwriting, Richard and Diane agreed to pledge their primary residence as collateral. They tied the fate of their own home to Vanessa's ability to pay a luxury mortgage. It was a staggering gamble driven entirely by ego and the fear of social embarrassment. 3 days later, they sat around a polished conference table at a title company. Richard signed his name dozens of times, affixing his legal responsibility to every page of the dense closing documents. Diane smiled for a photo with Vanessa holding up the keys to the new waterfront condo. They felt victorious. They believed they had saved the family image and provided their favorite daughter with the life she deserved. They ignored the fine print just as they had ignored the contract I handed them in the dining room. They did not consider the mathematical probability of default. Vanessa and Chase moved into the Bellevue unit that weekend. They posted photos of the skyline view, framing themselves as a wealthy, successful couple on social media. My parents liked every picture basking in the artificial glow of their sacrifice. They thought the crisis was averted. They thought their home was safe as long as Vanessa made the monthly payments. They did not understand the true nature of the man Vanessa brought into their lives. Chase did not care about family loyalty or maintaining suburban appearances. He only cared about leverage. The moment the title was recorded and the keys were handed over, he recognized an opportunity. While Vanessa was busy decorating the living room, Chase logged onto a secure banking portal. He used the newly acquired luxury property, backed entirely by my parents' life savings, to quietly open a six-figure home equity line of credit. He needed fresh capital to cover his failing digital trades and sustain his illusion of success. Operating in the shadows of Vanessa's ignorance, he signed the digital paperwork, effectively draining the remaining equity before the first mortgage payment was even due. The trap I had warned them about was no longer theoretical. It was fully armed, and the timer had just started ticking. The ink on the Bellevue property documents had barely dried before the reality of waterfront luxury set in for my parents. While the mortgage was a heavy anchor, the homeowners association fees were a hidden tidal wave. Premium buildings in that particular zip code demand exorbitant monthly dues to maintain infinity pools, private concierge desks, and dedicated security details. When the first billing cycle hit, Vanessa simply forwarded the invoice to our parents. Chase claimed his liquidity was tied up in a bearish crypto market, rendering him unable to contribute. The financial strain on Richard and Diane materialized instantly. Their comfortable retirement budget was suddenly hemorrhaging capital to sustain an illusion they did not even live in. The strain of these unexpected payments created a palpable tension in their household. Instead of holding Vanessa accountable for her choices, my parents turned their resentment toward me. In their minds, my refusal to hand over my tech salary was the true cause of their impending insolvency. They decided I needed to pay my fair share of the familial burden. They reasoned that because I lived a quiet life, I possessed a surplus of disposable income that rightfully belonged to the family collective. Since I was ignoring their phone calls and text messages, they chose a tactic designed to maximize social pressure. They drove across the floating bridge into downtown Seattle to confront me at my workplace. My firm operates out of a highly secure glass-clad tower in the South Lake Union District. It is not a place for casual drop-ins or unexpected family visits. The architecture is deliberately intimidating. The building features biometric turnstiles, armed security personnel, and receptionists trained to filter out uninvited variables. The culture is built on deep focus and extreme confidentiality. Disruptions are not tolerated, and emotional outbursts are viewed as a severe lack of professionalism. At 2 in the afternoon, an internal notification flashed across my tertiary monitor. The front desk alerted me that 2 individuals claiming to be my parents were demanding an immediate audience. They were refusing to leave the lobby until I came down. A lesser employee might have panicked, fearing the professional repercussions of a public family dispute. I felt my pulse steady. I closed my coding environment, locked my workstation, and walked toward the elevator bank. My gait was measured and my breathing remained even. I viewed the upcoming interaction not as a daughter facing her angry parents, but as a systems administrator isolating a security breach. The elevator doors parted on the ground floor. The lobby was a vast expanse of polished concrete, living green walls and natural light. My parents stood near the visitor desk, looking glaringly out of place among the badge-wearing software engineers and data scientists. I spotted my father immediately. He saw me approaching and reached up to adjust his silk tie, straightening his posture. It was a practiced, dominant gesture. He expected me to shrink in embarrassment under the gaze of my colleagues. He assumed the threat of a loud, humiliating scene would force me to usher them into a private conference room where they could bully me into compliance. I did not shrink. I did not speed up my pace to appease him. I walked directly to the reception desk, maintaining a distance of 3 feet from my father. I kept my hands resting lightly in the pockets of my tailored maternity trousers. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My tone was indistinguishable from the voice I used to order a morning coffee. My father dropped his hand from his tie. His expectant smirk faltered, replaced by a scowl. "We need to talk, Sloan," he said, keeping his volume intentionally high to attract the attention of a passing product manager. "Your sister is drowning in building fees, and you have responsibilities to this family. You are going to set up a recurring monthly transfer to cover her dues, or we are not leaving this lobby." My mother stepped forward, clutching her designer handbag like a shield against the corporate environment. "It is the least you can do," she chimed in, her voice trembling with practiced indignation. "We are sacrificing our savings, and you sit up in this glass tower ignoring us. It is shameful behavior." I let their words hang in the sterile air of the lobby. I did not flush with anger. I did not whisper frantic pleas for them to lower their voices. By stripping the interaction of all emotional response, I deprived them of the friction they needed to operate. They were throwing matches into a vacuum. "You are mistaken," I replied, my voice dropping to a cool and clinical register. "I have zero financial responsibilities to you or to Vanessa. Furthermore, you are currently standing on private corporate property without an invitation, a meeting on the books, or an employee escort." My father took a step closer, his face reddening with indignation. "Do not quote corporate policy to me," he snarled, pointing a finger in my direction. "I am your father. I will stand wherever I please until you do the right thing and write a check." I turned slightly toward the receptionist, a seasoned professional who was already monitoring the escalating dynamic. Then I looked back at my father. Under Washington state law specifically, the revised Code Section 9, a .52, a person is guilty of criminal trespass if they knowingly enter or remain unlawfully upon the premises of another. You have been informed you are not welcome. Your continued presence is a misdemeanor. The invocation of actual legal statutes in a flat, unbothered tone visibly stunned him. He was accustomed to emotional warfare guilt trips and manipulation. He was not prepared for penal codes. Sensing her husband losing ground, my mother pivoted to her most reliable strategy. She turned toward the receptionist, her eyes welling with instant theatrical tears. "Please," she gasped, placing a hand over her heart. "We are just worried grandparents. Our daughter is cutting us out and we are terrified for the baby. We just want to help her." She let a sob escape her throat, casting herself as the tragic victim for the benefit of anyone watching. 10 years ago, those tears might have paralyzed me. Today they registered as a pathetic malfunction in an outdated program. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I raised my right hand and delivered a subtle curt nod to the 2 corporate security officers stationed near the turnstiles. They had been waiting for my signal. The officers, dressed in dark tailored suits with discreet earpieces, moved with seamless efficiency. They stepped between me and my parents, forming an impenetrable human barrier. "Sir, ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice polite, but carrying the weight of immovable authority. "You need to vacate the premises immediately. If you refuse, we will involve the Seattle Police Department to facilitate your removal." My father opened his mouth to argue, his face flushed with a dangerous mixture of rage and profound humiliation. But the officers did not engage in debate. They simply advanced, forcing my parents to step backward toward the revolving glass doors. The lack of a scene, the cold and bureaucratic efficiency of their ejection, unnerved my parents more than any shouting match ever could. They had lost their favorite weapon. The audience they hoped to manipulate watched them get escorted out like common vagrants. I turned my back before they even reached the sidewalk. I walked to the elevator, swiped my badge, and returned to my desk. My heart rate had barely elevated. I resumed my coding, sinking back into the rhythm of the data. I knew the physical rejection would force my father to seek a new avenue of attack. Men who rely on dominance do not accept public defeat gracefully. They escalate. They search for a vulnerability they can exploit from a distance. An hour later, my phone illuminated with an incoming message. The preview text revealed it was from Richard. I did not open it immediately. I finished the algorithm I was building, compiled the code, and then unlocked the device to read the threat. The message was a masterclass in vindictive desperation. He realized he could not touch my finances, my property, or my career, so he aimed for the only variable I had left exposed. "You think you can humiliate us and walk away?" The message read. "You are unstable and unfit to raise a child in that sterile and isolated life of yours. We are retaining legal counsel tomorrow morning. We are filing a lawsuit for grandparents' rights the minute that baby is born. We will take custody Sloan. Watch yourself." I stared at the glowing screen. The threat was designed to strike terror into the heart of a pregnant woman. It was meant to induce panic, sleepless nights, and a desperate plea for a truce. My father wanted to drag me into a brutal family court battle, weaponizing the legal system to claim ownership of my daughter. The threat of a custody lawsuit is designed to paralyze a prospective mother. The concept of grandparents' rights is a frequent weapon wielded by estranged family members to force continued contact under the guise of the child's best interest. My father sent that text, assuming the mere suggestion of family court would crack my composure. He expected me to hire a mediator, break my silence, and beg for a settlement to keep my daughter safe. He fundamentally misunderstood how I process risk. I do not negotiate with hostile variables. I terminate their access to the system. The legal framework of Washington state is complex, but ultimately the law functions similarly to a strict coding language. It runs on inputs, established rules, and verifiable outputs. I spent the night compiling my inputs. The following morning, I took a private car service to the financial district in downtown Seattle. The gray, overcast sky mirrored the sleek, imposing architecture of the high-rise buildings. My destination was the executive suite of Evelyn Reed. Evelyn served as a senior partner at a boutique family law firm renowned for handling high-asset divorces and complex custody disputes. She possessed a reputation for being clinical, unyielding, and exceptionally expensive. She did not operate on sentimentality or emotional appeals. She operated on precedent and evidentiary weight, making her the perfect proxy for my defense. I sat across from her in a minimalist conference room overlooking the dark waters of the Puget Sound. I did not waste time with tears or fearful exposition. I opened my briefcase and placed a thick, leather-bound folio on the glass table. The folio contained a heavily categorized data set of my parents' harassment over the past few weeks. I provided the printed transcripts of every voicemail Diane had left cross-referenced with the original audio files stored on an encrypted flash drive. I included the network metadata and exact IP logs detailing my father's fraudulent attempt to terminate my residential lease with the property management firm. Every threat, every manipulation, and every attempt at sabotage was documented, time-stamped, and mathematically irrefutable. Evelyn flipped through the first few tabs. Her expression remained impassive, betraying no surprise. She noted the chronological organization and the undeniable proof of systemic harassment. "This is a very thorough foundation for a restraining order," she remarked. Her eyes scanned the printed IP logs with sharp precision. But grandparents' rights petitions in this jurisdiction require the petitioners to prove they have an established, meaningful relationship with the minor and that denying visitation would cause actual harm to the child. Given that your baby is not even born, their case is incredibly weak. However, wealthy petitioners can drag these proceedings out for years. They use the discovery process to drain your resources, hoping to force you into perpetual litigation until you simply surrender out of exhaustion. "That is an unacceptable outcome," I replied smoothly. "I do not intend to spend the next decade defending my perimeter in a courtroom. Please turn to tab 4. Evelyn flipped the heavy cardstock divider. Beneath it lay the original notarized copy of the financial severance and liability transfer contract that my parents had signed in my dining room weeks prior. She adjusted her reading glasses and began to scan the introductory paragraphs. As she reached the indemnification clauses, her posture changed. She sat up straighter, reading the dense legal terminology with mounting intensity. The document did not merely excuse me from paying for Vanessa's condominium. When I drafted the contract, I embedded a preemptive legal severance utilizing specific state statutes regarding the waiver of familial rights. By accepting the immediate transfer of the $100,000 trust fund, Richard and Diane legally codified that they were exchanging all future claims of familial association for instant capital. Clause D explicitly stated that the signatories waived any standing to pursue custody visitation or guardianship of any current or future dependents of Sloane Sterling. It bound them to a strict non-interference agreement, indemnifying me against any legal actions they might initiate. Evelyn finished reading the final page and looked up. She stared at me with a profound sense of professional respect. "You drafted this yourself?" she asked. I utilized my understanding of conditional logic, I explained. A contract is simply an algorithm written in legal syntax. If they accept Condition A, which was the money, they trigger the execution of Condition B, which was the forfeiture of their rights. They wanted the funds quickly to satisfy their own egos. They signed it voluntarily in front of a witness. Evelyn traced the dual signatures at the bottom of the page. "This is ironclad," she stated. Her voice carried an edge of genuine admiration. They traded their legal standing for a cash payout. Any family court judge in this state would take one look at this severance and dismiss their petition with prejudice. Furthermore, because of the penalty clauses you included, if they even attempt to file the paperwork, they will be held liable for all your attorney fees and court costs. They dug a pit, jumped inside, and handed you the only ladder. The threat of a custody battle is dead on arrival. I thanked Evelyn for her time and paid her retainer to keep her on standby. Stepping out onto the bustling Seattle pavement, I felt a deep, resonant sense of safety. The persistent hum of my parents' toxic entitlement had been permanently muted. I had protected my daughter before she even took her first breath. I returned to my Queen Anne townhouse. The environment welcomed me with optimized lighting and ambient temperature control. I spent the evening organizing the final components of the nursery, running diagnostic tests on the smart bassinet, and finalizing my maternity leave handover protocols for the tech firm. My world was quiet, predictable, and fortified by irrefutable data. I experienced the supreme peace that accompanies true self-reliance. I did not need to check my phone for angry messages because my legal barrier rendered their anger irrelevant. While I rested in my secure fortress, the alternate variable in this equation was rapidly deteriorating. The consequences of treating wealth as a limitless illusion were catching up to my sister across the lake in Bellevue. It was nearly midnight when the silence of my bedroom was broken by a shrill, frantic ringing. I checked the caller identification. It was a number I did not recognize, but the persistent, desperate cadence of the incoming call signaled an anomaly. I answered the phone, maintaining my standard neutral greeting. Sloan, a voice gasped through the speaker. It was Vanessa. She was sobbing so hard she could barely draw oxygen into her lungs. The sound was raw, stripped of her usual curated arrogance. "Sloan, please do not hang up on me. You have to help me." I sat up in bed, resting my back against the headboard. I did not offer comfort. I simply waited for the data point she was trying to deliver. "State your purpose, Vanessa," I instructed. "He is gone," she wailed. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings of her empty luxury unit. "Chase is gone. I woke up and all his things were missing from the closet. His car is not in the garage. People terminate relationships frequently," I observed. "Why are you calling me in the middle of the night?" "Because he took everything," Vanessa screamed. The panic fractured her vocal cords. "I tried to log into the banking portal to pay the homeowners association dues. The account is empty, Sloan. He opened a home equity line of credit against the condo right after we closed. He maxed it out. He took all the cash and he transferred it to an offshore crypto exchange. I cannot reach him. The phone number is disconnected." The mathematical probability of this outcome had been exceptionally high from the beginning. Chase had identified a vulnerable target, secured access to her capital, and executed his exit strategy the moment the funds became liquid. "And the primary mortgage?" I inquired, already knowing the answer. "The bank sent an urgent notice this afternoon." Vanessa sobbed. Her breathing spiraled into hyperventilation. "The automated payment bounced. The equity is entirely gone. They are initiating immediate foreclosure proceedings. Sloan, they are going to take the condo. They are going to take Mom and Dad's house. They are going to take everything." The midnight phone call ended with a simple tap on my screen. I did not offer Vanessa false comfort or promises of intervention. The data had already run its course. Chase executed his exit strategy flawlessly, extracting maximum liquidity before vanishing. By morning, the financial contagion had breached the Bellevue condo and crossed Lake Washington, infecting my parents' pristine suburban sanctuary. The mechanics of a co-signed mortgage backed by collateral are unforgiving. When the primary borrower defaults on an over-leveraged property, the lending institution does not send polite reminders. They initiate asset recovery. The bank recognized that Vanessa possessed zero capital, so they immediately targeted the guarantors. The equity line of credit Chase drained was tethered directly to the deed of my parents' home. The trap they built to save their social standing was now crushing them under its own mathematical weight. 2 days later, my phone registered an incoming communication from Richard. It was a formal summons disguised as an urgent family invitation. In a state of profound desperation, my parents chose to develop sudden amnesia regarding our previous encounters. They conveniently ignored the fact that my corporate security team had escorted them out of a downtown Seattle lobby. They bypassed the reality that Richard recently threatened to sue me for custody of my unborn child. Panic operates as a powerful filter, allowing arrogant individuals to erase their own transgressions when they require a savior. Their message dictated that I must attend a mandatory gathering at their house that evening to discuss an urgent crisis. They operated on the delusion that familial duty would compel me to liquidate my tech sector portfolio to rectify their mistakes. Standard behavioral logic dictates that a person in my position should ignore the summons. I held an ironclad legal severance and possessed no obligation to witness their collapse. However, as a data scientist, I recognized the value of observing the final output of a prolonged experiment. I decided to attend the meeting. I did not go out of lingering loyalty or a desire to gloat. I went to deliver the final variable in my dataset and close the ledger permanently. I prepared for the encounter with deliberate care. In the Pacific Northwest, wealth signals itself through understated quality rather than loud branding. I dressed in tailored charcoal maternity trousers and a pristine ivory cashmere turtleneck. I draped a structured camel coat over my shoulders. I looked radiant, well-rested, and visibly insulated from the chaos eroding their lives. My appearance was a calculated projection of the exact stability they were about to lose. I drove my sedan to their upscale neighborhood and parked in the circular driveway. The exterior of their home remained immaculate, boasting manicured hedges and flawless paint. Yet the atmosphere inside felt remarkably different. When I walked through the front door, the air hung stale and heavy. The usual scent of fresh lilies and lemon polish was absent. My father paced the length of the formal living room. His posture was rigid, and his face appeared hollow. My mother sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, clutching a crumpled tissue, her eyes red and darting. Vanessa was not present. She had likely retreated to her unfurnished luxury unit to avoid facing the architects of her ruin. Richard stopped pacing the moment I entered the room. He took in my composed demeanor and pristine attire, and his jaw tightened. Instead of leading with an apology for his past threats, he reverted to his customary boardroom tactics. He attempted to seize control of the narrative before I could establish a boundary. "Sloane, we do not have time for pleasantries or past grievances," my father commanded. His voice strained to maintain its usual booming authority, but a noticeable tremor betrayed his panic. "Your sister made a severe miscalculation with her partner. The man turned out to be a fraud. He stole the equity and abandoned the property. The bank is demanding immediate restitution, and they are threatening to place a lien on this house." My mother leaned forward, twisting the tissue in her hands. "We are facing a catastrophe, Sloane. We could lose everything: the country club, our retirement, the house. We need you to step up." I remained standing near the entryway, keeping a neutral expression. I did not prompt them to continue, nor did I offer a sympathetic reaction. My silence forced Richard to articulate the exact depth of their entitlement. "The bank requires a cash injection to halt the foreclosure proceedings on both properties," Richard stated, closing the distance between us. "We need $300,000 wired into our primary account by tomorrow morning. You work in the tech sector. You have access to restricted stock units and liquid capital. You are going to transfer the funds to save this family. We will draft a repayment plan once Vanessa gets back on her feet." The audacity of the demand was staggering. After attempting to terminate my residential lease, threatening a custody battle, and prioritizing a runaway daughter, they genuinely expected me to write a six-figure check to preserve their social status. They believed the biological connection somehow overrode my instinct for self-preservation. I maintained my composure, analyzing the erratic rhythm of his breathing. When I did not immediately produce a checkbook, my father's fear transmuted into hostility. He resorted to the only leverage he believed he still held. "If you walk away from us right now, we will make sure everyone in Seattle knows exactly what kind of daughter you are," Richard threatened. His face flushed a deep crimson. "We will call your executives. We will contact your colleagues. We will ruin your professional reputation. We will tell the entire community that you hoarded your wealth while your own parents were thrown into the street. You will be a pariah." My mother chimed in, elevating her volume to match his hostility. "Do not force us to do this, Sloane. We gave you everything. We raised you. You owe us this fraction of your portfolio. If you let the bank take our home, you will carry that guilt for the rest of your life. Your child will grow up knowing her mother destroyed her own family over a petty grudge." They were utilizing a classic extortion framework. They combined exorbitant financial demands with the threat of social annihilation and profound emotional blackmail. They expected the sheer weight of their combined aggression to fracture my defenses. In their outdated worldview, a younger female relative must ultimately bow to the patriarchal demand for resources. They failed to recognize that a data scientist builds systems specifically designed to withstand peak stress loads without breaking. I viewed their desperate threats as faulty inputs generating useless errors. Reputation damage requires a credible source. A bankrupt consultant and his complicit wife, soon to be publicly humiliated by a foreclosure, held zero credibility in my professional sphere. I did not raise my voice to defend my character. I did not engage with the threat to my career. Arguing with a drowning man only pulls you under the water. Instead, I calmly walked over to the glass coffee table situated between them. I carried a sleek leather briefcase, a functional piece of hardware that contrasted sharply with their decorative surroundings. I set the case down on the glass surface. The metallic click of the dual latches opening echoed loudly in the tense silence of the living room. Richard and Diane watched my hands with hungry anticipation, their eyes locked onto the briefcase. For a fleeting second, their posture softened. They genuinely believed I was retrieving a checkbook, a wire transfer authorization, or a portfolio statement proving I could meet their exorbitant demand. The delusion of imminent rescue washed over their faces, replacing their hostility with a sickening, greedy relief. I reached inside the lined interior. I did not pull out a checkbook. I retrieved a single sheet of standard printer paper. It was a heavily redacted spreadsheet I had compiled earlier that afternoon. The document contained specific financial projections, timelines, and legal clauses, synthesized into one undeniable conclusion. I had stripped away all the irrelevant data, leaving only the brutal mathematics of their current predicament and the historical record of their choices. I placed the document face down on the table. My father reached for it, assuming it was a draft of a loan agreement. I kept my hand firmly planted on the top of the page, preventing him from flipping it over. I required his full attention before delivering the payload. "You summoned me here under the assumption that I am a resource you can tap when your preferred investments fail," I said. My voice was chillingly calm, carrying the distinct cadence of a final verdict. "You assumed my silence over the past month was born of weakness. You calculated that my impending motherhood made me vulnerable to your extortion. You miscalculated every single variable." My father's hand hovered over the table. His brow furrowed as the realization dawned that no financial salvation was forthcoming. "What are you playing at, Sloan?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am concluding the transaction," I replied. I lifted my hand and flipped the spreadsheet over. I slid the document across the smooth glass surface until it rested directly in front of him. I maintained unbroken eye contact, refusing to let him look away until I issued the final directive. I pointed a steady finger at the paper. "Read the highlighted row," I instructed. The spreadsheet mapped out his remaining liquid assets against the mounting liabilities of the Bellevue waterfront condo and his primary residence. The highlighted row displayed a specific date just 3 weeks away. It was the exact moment his cash reserves would fall below the threshold required to satisfy the banking institution. It was the mathematical point of his inevitable financial ruin. Richard refused to process the information. He shoved the paper across the glass coffee table, treating the data like an offensive suggestion. He raised his voice, attempting to replace facts with volume. He shouted that spreadsheets did not matter in the real world. He insisted that I was sitting on a mountain of hoarded capital. He brought up the trust fund again. He claimed that since I never received the $100,000 and since I earned a lucrative salary in the technology sector, my personal bank accounts must be overflowing. He dictated that I possessed a moral and biological obligation to liquidate my assets immediately, to save them from foreclosure. He pointed a trembling finger in my direction, demanding a wire transfer, insisting that I owed them my livelihood because they gave me life. I watched his chest heave. I catalogued the sweat forming on his brow. The desperation rolling off him was palpable, a sharp contrast to his usual polished demeanor. I waited for him to finish his tirade. Silence is a powerful tool when deployed against a person who is unraveling. I let his shouted demands echo and fade into the corners of the immaculate living room. When the quiet finally returned, I delivered the ultimate conclusion of my data set. "You voted to steal my down payment," I stated. I maintained a flat and unyielding tone. "You forgot I already owned the house." The words hung in the space between us. Richard stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Diane looked up from her crumpled tissue. Their brains struggled to parse the syntax of my statement. It defied the entire narrative they had constructed about my life. I allowed the reality to settle before I explained the mechanics of their failure. 6 months before you called that family meeting to reallocate my trust fund, I closed on a premium 4-unit property in the Queen Anne neighborhood, I explained. I did not need the grandfathered money. I utilized the restricted stock units that vested during my company going public. I bypassed your control entirely. I purchased the building secured tenants for 3 of the units and established a passive income stream that covers my entire mortgage. I have been a property owner for nearly a year. Richard stared at me. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The foundation of his authority rested on the belief that he controlled my access to the real estate market. The $100,000 was never a requirement for my survival. I continued, it was a diagnostic tool. When you summoned me to the dining room to announce you were handing my designated capital to Vanessa, I already held the deed to my home. I allowed you to take the money. I needed to observe your behavior when presented with a choice between my secure future and her reckless entitlement. You behaved exactly as my predictive models anticipated. You stole from a pregnant woman to fund a volatile illusion. You walked willingly into the trap because your arrogance blinded you to the possibility that I possessed resources beyond your supervision. Diane dropped her tissue. The manicured hands that poured tea during that fateful meeting now trembled uncontrollably. The tears spilling down her cheeks were no longer theatrical weapons designed to elicit sympathy. They were the authentic and visceral byproduct of profound regret. She finally comprehended the magnitude of their miscalculation. They traded their secure retirement, their paid-off home, and their immaculate social standing to appease a daughter who drained their equity and vanished. In the process, they alienated the daughter who held genuine wealth. The irony crushed her. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing into the quiet room. Richard could not accept defeat. His ego refused to surrender to the mathematics laid out on the table. He attempted to pivot, grasping for a new angle of attack. He leaned over the glass table, his face contorted with remaining defiance. "It does not matter when you bought your house," Richard spat. His voice was raspy. "You still have the resources. You are my child. I am your father. I will not lose my home while you sit in a luxury townhouse generating passive income. I will take you to court. I will sue you for filial support. I will tell a judge that you possess exorbitant wealth and are intentionally allowing your elderly parents to face destitution. The legal system will force you to provide for us." His threat was a desperate grasp at an obsolete concept. He assumed the court system operated on sentimentality and biological ties. He believed a judge would look at his ruined finances and force a successful tech worker to open her checkbook. He forgot the fundamental rule of Washington state law: contracts supersede emotion. I did not flinch at his threat. I simply reached back into my leather briefcase. I retrieved the second document I brought with me. It was printed on the same 24-pound linen paper I presented weeks ago. It bore the official seal of a licensed notary public. I placed it gently on the glass table, sliding it until it rested directly beside the spreadsheet of his impending bankruptcy. "You cannot sue me for financial support," I informed him. My voice was devoid of anger, registering only cold, factual certainty. "You severed your legal standing to make any such claim." Richard looked down at the paper. It was the financial severance and liability transfer contract. He recognized his own sweeping signature at the bottom of the page. He recognized Diane's frantic scribble beside it. "During our initial meeting, I traded my claim to the trust fund for this specific boundary," I explained. "I allowed you to take the $100,000 because purchasing my permanent legal freedom from your poor decisions was worth the capital expenditure. You were so eager to secure the funds for Vanessa that you refused to read the stipulations. You signed away your rights to demand elder care emergency bailouts or familial support. You indemnified me against your exact current situation." I pointed to the third paragraph on the page. I instructed him to read the fine print. Richard picked up the contract. His hands shook, rattling the heavy paper. He pushed his silver reading glasses up the bridge of his nose. He began to read the dense legal terminology he previously dismissed as a petty game. He read the statutes governing the waiver of fiduciary duty. He read the specific clauses detailing that the signatories assume sole responsibility for their own debts and forfeit any legal avenue to pursue compensation from Sloane Sterling. The silence in the living room expanded, swallowing the remnants of my father's pride. I sat perfectly still, watching the cognitive dissonance ravage his features. For his entire adult life, Richard believed that a firm handshake and a loud voice could override any obstacle. He operated under the assumption that rules applied only to other people. The contract trembling in his grip was a tangible manifestation of reality crashing into his delusion. He traced the lines of text with a shaking index finger, silently mouthing the legal jargon that formed the cage around his future. Diane lifted her head from her hands. Her makeup was ruined, tracking dark lines across her pale cheeks. She looked at her husband, searching his face for a denial, waiting for him to announce a loophole. She waited for the patriarch to fix the crisis. "Richard," she whispered. Her voice was fragile and broken. "Richard, tell her she is wrong. Tell her we can fight this." Richard did not answer her. He could not look his wife in the eye. He dropped the contract back onto the glass coffee table. The paper landed with a soft and final sound. He slumped backward into the upholstery of the armchair. The rigid posture he maintained for decades dissolved. He looked suddenly aged, his skin graying under the ambient lighting of the expensive chandelier hanging above us. It was the chandelier they would soon be forced to leave behind. "The spreadsheet details the inevitable loss of this property," I stated, breaking the quiet. "The contract details my complete legal immunity from your loss. You prioritized Vanessa. You funded her transition. You pledged this house as collateral to protect your social image. You made these choices voluntarily. My only action was anticipating your behavior and insulating myself from the blast radius. I slowly closed the clasps on my briefcase. The metallic clicks signaled the conclusion of our business. I delivered the data. I presented the unalterable outcome of their equation. There was nothing left to debate. The truth does not require a raised voice to be understood. It simply requires the right documentation. I prepared to stand up. My father remained paralyzed in his chair, his eyes locked on the fine print he ignored months ago. He was trapped in a prison constructed entirely from his own arrogance, reading the precise legal coordinates of his ruin. The full weight of the legal instrument settled over the living room, suffocating the last remnants of my father's pride. Richard spent 30 years running a corporate consulting firm in Bellevue, advising wealthy clients on risk management, asset protection, and contract negotiations. He built an entire career instructing his subordinates to scrutinize every binding agreement before applying ink to paper. Yet he sat paralyzed on his own velvet sofa, realizing he had violated his own cardinal rule. He failed to read the document in my dining room because he viewed me as an inferior intellect. He looked at his quiet, pregnant daughter and saw only an obedient variable he could manipulate. He never considered that my daily profession involves identifying structural vulnerabilities and exploiting them to secure desired outcomes. The severance agreement was notarized airtight and unyielding under Washington state law. The jurisdiction heavily favors the written word over verbal assumptions or familial expectations. By signing the paper to quickly secure the initial trust fund for Vanessa Richard, and Diane legally codified a devastating transfer of obligation. The contract explicitly stated that they assumed all future financial liabilities for their preferred daughter. It detailed that they alone would bear the burden of her housing, her debts, and her living expenses. Simultaneously, the document relinquished any legal standing they held to request financial aid, elder care, or emergency capital from me. I had severed the branch they were standing on, and they had willingly handed me the saw. I sat across from them, maintaining the detached precision required in my field. Your insolvency is mathematically guaranteed, I explained quietly. The numbers do not possess empathy, and they do not care about your reputation at the country club. The Bellevue property carries a monthly carrying cost that far exceeds your consulting revenue and pension distributions combined. The secondary equity line of credit that Chase drained is a secured debt tied directly to the deed of this specific house. You sacrificed your own secure retirement to fund a fleeting delusion. The banking institution will not accept apologies or social standing as valid currency. They will demand liquid capital, and your spreadsheets indicate you possess none. My mother let out a sharp, ragged breath. The reality of her impending destitution fractured the polished veneer she spent decades cultivating. She looked around the immaculate living room, taking in the expensive artwork, the custom furniture, and the crystal chandelier. She realized that every single item surrounding her was about to become the property of a commercial lender. Diane turned her head slowly, staring at her husband. The unconditional support she normally offered him vanished, replaced by a profound and bitter resentment. She realized Richard had confidently steered them into a financial abyss just to win a petty argument with their youngest child. Richard could not accept the finality of the situation. Men who rely on intimidation rarely surrender without a final, desperate attempt to rewrite reality. He dropped the linen paper onto the glass table and stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. He tried to summon his boardroom authority, but his voice shook with impotent rage. "This is fraud," Richard spat, glaring down at me. "You deliberately concealed the intent of this paperwork. You handed us a dense legal trap while we were focused on helping your sister. No judge in this state will uphold a contract signed under deceptive conditions. I will hire a litigator tomorrow morning. I will sue you for predatory practices, and I will have this entire agreement voided in court." I did not flinch at his rising volume. I reached forward and tapped the center of the document. "Fraud requires deception," I corrected him, keeping my tone even and unbothered. "The terms of this agreement are printed in standard 12-point font. I did not hide the indemnification clauses in microscopic text, nor did I coerce you into signing. I presented the trade clearly. I offered you the trust fund in exchange for my permanent legal boundary. You signed it voluntarily in broad daylight because you were in a rush to play the savior for Vanessa. Richard paced a short line behind the coffee table like a trapped animal testing the perimeter of a cage. You tricked us, Sloane. I did not trick you, I replied. I simply allowed your own arrogance to dictate your actions. You chose not to read the document because your ego convinced you that I was incapable of outsmarting you. You assumed I was throwing a harmless tantrum. You believed you held all the leverage, and you were too focused on securing the cash to perform basic due diligence. Your hubris was the primary vulnerability in this equation. I did not force you into ruin. I just opened the door, and you sprinted inside. He stopped pacing. The realization that he was the architect of his own destruction drained the remaining color from his face. He had spent his life evaluating risk, yet he failed to recognize the most dangerous variable sitting across his own dining table. The legal framework protecting me was impenetrable. I was legally untouchable, insulated by the very signature he provided with a smug flourish weeks ago. I reached forward and retrieved my documents from the glass table. I placed the spreadsheet and the original contract back into my leather briefcase. I aligned the edges perfectly, maintaining the organized methodology that governs my life. I closed the dual latches, the metallic clicks echoing loudly in the suffocating silence of the room. I picked up the briefcase and stood to my feet. I adjusted the collar of my camel coat, looking radiant rested and entirely unaffected by the tragedy unfolding in their home. I am returning to my residence now, I announced. I suggest you spend your remaining time reviewing your packing options. The foreclosure timeline in this county operates with remarkable efficiency once the initial notices are filed. I turned away from the seating area and began walking toward the grand entryway. Behind me, the internal dynamics of my parents' marriage shattered into irrecoverable pieces. Diane unleashed a torrent of frantic accusations, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She blamed Richard for risking their home, for failing to read the contract, and for indulging Vanessa's reckless behavior. Richard shouted back his defensive anger, masking a deep, hollow terror. The unified front they presented to the world dissolved into a chaotic, bitter argument over who was responsible for their downfall. The noise was loud, ugly, and entirely irrelevant to my future. I reached the front door and rested my hand on the polished brass handle. I felt a deep sense of closure. The long chapter of emotional manipulation and financial leverage was permanently finished. I had survived the environment they built, and I had ensured my daughter would never have to navigate their toxic expectations. Just as I prepared to turn the handle, a sharp, rhythmic sound interrupted the argument echoing from the living room. Someone was knocking on the exterior of the heavy wooden door. The knocking was firm, purposeful, and unyielding. It did not sound like a friendly neighbor stopping by to borrow a tool or a delivery driver dropping off a package. It carried the distinct cadence of official business. The shouting in the living room ceased immediately. Richard and Diane were deeply conditioned to protect their public image. They could not allow anyone outside the family to witness their domestic instability. I heard my father's heavy footsteps crossing the hardwood floor, rushing to intercept whoever was waiting on the porch. I stepped aside, leaving a clear path for him to reach the entryway. Richard approached the door, hastily smoothing his hair and adjusting the collar of his shirt. He pasted his customary confident smile onto his face, attempting to project the illusion of the successful suburban patriarch one last time. He grabbed the brass handle and pulled the door open. A man in a standard gray windbreaker stood on the porch holding a thick clipboard and a large manila envelope. The visitor did not return my father's artificial smile. He checked a printed photograph attached to his clipboard, verifying the identity of the person standing in the doorway. Richard Sterling. The man asked, his tone devoid of any conversational warmth. "Yes," my father answered, his smile faltering slightly as he recognized the formal posture of the visitor. "How can I help you this evening?" The man did not offer a greeting or an explanation. He simply pulled a thick stack of legal documents from the manila envelope and thrust them directly against my father's chest. "You have been served," the process server stated. Richard instinctively brought his hands up, catching the heavy stack of paper before it could fall to the porch. He looked down at the documents resting in his hands. The bold, capitalized text across the top page was visible even from where I stood in the hallway. It was the official notice of default and intent to foreclose filed by the commercial lending institution holding the debt on the Bellevue property. The banking system had arrived to collect their collateral right on schedule. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving Richard holding the thick stack of foreclosure documents against his chest. The process server retreated down the driveway, a silent messenger of their impending ruin. For most individuals, receiving a notice of default triggers a frantic reassessment of finances. For my parents, it triggered a frantic reassessment of their public image. They did not sit down to review their remaining budget or contact a bankruptcy attorney. They immediately began calculating how to spin the narrative. In their worldview, losing a multi-million-dollar property was a tragedy, but losing their social standing was a fatal blow. The affluent enclaves surrounding Seattle operate on a very specific cultural currency. Wealth is the baseline and assumed prerequisite for entry. The true metrics of status are shrewdness, integrity, and the ability to honor a legally binding agreement. The local elite do not respect victims of poor investments, and they harbor a fierce disdain for individuals who fail to manage their own liabilities. My parents understood this environment implicitly. They knew that if the truth regarding their foolish gamble on Vanessa became public knowledge, they would be ostracized. They needed a scapegoat to preserve their dignity within their tight-knit suburban circle. They decided to launch a desperate preemptive smear campaign. The stage they chose was the Saturday evening mixer at their exclusive country club. This weekly event served as the central nervous system for local gossip. Richard and Diane spent the next 48 hours rehearsing a fabricated tragedy. They planned to present themselves as devoted self-sacrificing parents who were cruelly abandoned by their youngest child. They would weave a tale depicting me as a greedy, unfeeling tech worker who stole her sister's rightful inheritance and hoarded a vast fortune while leaving her elderly parents destitute. They expected their peers to rally around them, offering sympathetic murmurs and perhaps exerting back-channel pressure on me to fulfill my familial duties. On Saturday evening, they dressed with meticulous care. Richard wore his tailored navy blazer while Diane selected a muted silk dress that projected elegant sorrow. They drove to the club, practicing their expressions of stoic grief in the rearview mirror. They walked through the grand double doors of the clubhouse, anticipating the warm embrace of their community. They expected friends to rush forward with concerned inquiries, providing the perfect opening to deploy their manufactured narrative. Instead, they walked into a wall of impenetrable frost. The main dining room was crowded with familiar faces, clinking glasses, and low murmurs of conversation. As Richard and Diane went to approach their usual table, the atmosphere shifted. It was not a sudden dramatic silence. It was a subtle, coordinated withdrawal. Eye contact was deliberately avoided. Small groups shifted their physical positioning, creating closed circles that offered no entry point for newcomers. The polite but ruthless society of the Pacific Northwest does not engage in loud public confrontations. They execute social exile through devastating unspoken exclusion. Richard spotted a fellow consultant he had known for 2 decades standing near the bar. He adjusted his posture, pasting on a brave smile, and stepped forward to initiate contact. He opened his mouth to deliver the rehearsed opening line about family struggles and ungrateful children. The colleague did not let him speak. The man offered a curt, singular nod, turned on his heel, and walked away toward the terrace. Diane experienced a similar rejection near the coat check. She attempted to catch the eye of a woman she played tennis with every Tuesday for the past 8 years. The woman briefly met Diane's gaze, her expression devoid of any warmth, and then picked up her clutch to walk in the opposite direction. Panic began to flutter beneath my father's tailored blazer. He could not comprehend the uniform rejection. He assumed the foreclosure notice had somehow leaked to the public record faster than anticipated. He did not realize that the community was not reacting to his insolvency. They were reacting to his profound lack of integrity. A data scientist understands that a system is only as secure as its most vulnerable node. When I drafted the financial severance and liability transfer contract, I recognized that my parents would eventually try to weaponize their social circle against me. They relied on controlling the flow of information to manipulate their peers. To neutralize this threat, I needed to corrupt their data stream before they could deploy it. 3 weeks prior to their arrival at the country club, I compiled a digital dossier. The package contained a pristine scanned copy of the notarized severance agreement, clearly displaying their voluntary signatures. I included a chronological timeline of their harassing behavior, featuring the exact transcripts of my father's threats regarding the custody of my unborn child. I attached the verified IP logs documenting his fraudulent attempt to cancel my residential lease. I stripped the dossier of all emotional commentary, presenting only the brutal empirical facts of their extortion and their reckless financial gamble on Vanessa. I did not broadcast this packet to the entire world. I utilized targeted distribution. I identified the 5 central matriarchs and key gossip nodes within their country club ecosystem. These were the individuals who controlled the flow of social currency, the gatekeepers of reputation. I blind copied them on a single concise email. I framed the correspondence as a formal notification explaining that I was preemptively securing my professional and personal perimeter against anticipated defamation. I provided the receipts and allowed the data to speak for itself. The evidence was irrefutable. The country club elite reviewed the binding contract. They read the cruel text messages. They saw the verifiable proof that Richard and Diane traded their own security for a cash grab, signed away their rights, and then attempted to destroy my livelihood when their golden child defaulted. In a culture that fiercely respects legal boundaries and quiet resilience, my parents' behavior was deemed unforgivable. They were not viewed as tragic victims. They were exposed as deceitful, reckless liabilities. Standing in the center of the dining room, the reality of their situation finally breached my parents' denial. The fabricated story they spent 2 days rehearsing turned to ash in their mouths. They could not play the victim because the entire room had already reviewed the autopsy of their deceit. They were surrounded by peers who knew every ugly detail of their extortion. The final shattering blow arrived moments later. Diane stood near the central fireplace, her hands trembling as she surveyed the hostile room. She saw her closest confidant, a woman she had shared vacations and holidays with for over a decade, walking toward the exit. Diane stepped forward, her eyes pleading for a lifeline, reaching out a shaking hand to intercept her friend. She expected a whisper of solidarity, a secret assurance that their bond transcended the current scandal. The friend did not break stride. She looked right through Diane, her features set in a mask of polite indifference. She walked past my mother without uttering a single syllable, leaving Diane's outstretched hand suspended in the cold air. That silent dismissal broke the remaining fragments of their facade. The social death was final and absolute. There was no recovering from this level of ostracization. Richard and Diane turned around and walked out of the clubhouse. They did not speak to each other on the drive back to their neighborhood. They returned to a sprawling suburban house that the bank was already preparing to seize. They sat in the dark living room surrounded by expensive furniture they no longer owned, facing a future defined by total isolation and financial ruin. While they sat in the ruins of their own making, my evening unfolded in a state of profound tranquility. I was in the sanctuary of my Queen Anne townhouse. The ambient lighting glowed with a warm, dim hue, and the automated climate control maintained a perfect temperature. I reclined on my sofa, reviewing a finalized code deployment on my tablet. The silence in my home was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of defeat. It was the pristine, expansive silence of a fully secured perimeter. I set my tablet on the coffee table and closed my eyes, savoring the deep peace I had engineered for my family. The ledger was closed. The toxic variables were permanently excised from my dataset. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound sense of readiness for the next chapter of my life. Then a sharp, distinct physical sensation interrupted the calm. It was not a flutter or a subtle shift. It was a sudden, unmistakable rupture deep within my abdomen. A warm rush of fluid followed, breaking the pristine quiet of my living room. The predictive timeline I had charted for my pregnancy reached its ultimate conclusion. My water just broke. The next variable was arriving. Variable was the physical sensation of the amniotic sac rupturing requires immediate sequential action. I did not experience a surge of panic when the fluid broke the quiet sanctity of my living room. I simply glanced at my smartwatch, registering the exact time of the event to provide accurate data to my medical team. I stood up from the sofa, walked to the utility closet, and retrieved the specialized cleaning supplies to neutralize any potential moisture damage to the hardwood floor. Taking care of my property remained a priority even in the initial stages of labor. Once the surface was pristine, I initiated my hospital protocol. I had packed my overnight bag exactly 30 days prior, optimizing the contents for maximum utility and comfort. I retrieved the leather duffel from the front closet. Using my mobile device, I requested a premium black car service rather than relying on a standard taxi or driving myself. The application indicated a 3-minute arrival time. I tracked the onset of my first significant contraction. The muscular tightening was intense but manageable, radiating across my abdomen in a predictable wave. I breathed through the discomfort, measuring the duration. 45 seconds. The data confirmed I was entering the active phase of labor. I exited my townhouse through the private rear corridor that connected to my secured garage. The heavy steel door locked automatically behind me, engaging the deadbolt and arming the perimeter alarms. I stepped out into the crisp night air just as the luxury transport vehicle pulled into the private alleyway. The driver opened the rear door, and I settled into the plush leather seating. The interior of the car was climate-controlled and remarkably silent, offering an ideal environment to focus on my physiological metrics. As the vehicle navigated away from the alley and merged onto the main thoroughfare, a high-priority notification overrode the standard display on my tablet. The system alerted me to a perimeter breach at the primary pedestrian gate of my property. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I simply tapped the notification to access the live high-definition visual feed. The night vision cameras illuminated the front entrance of my building. Standing on the sidewalk, clutching a designer handbag and shivering in the damp Seattle cold was my older sister. Vanessa was supposed to be residing in a luxury Bellevue condominium, basking in the glow of my stolen trust fund. However, the mathematics of her poor decisions had clearly accelerated. The commercial lender seized the waterfront property the moment the automated payments failed. Chase had vanished with the remaining equity, leaving her wholly devoid of capital or shelter. Having exhausted her social currency and facing the humiliation of a foreclosed home, Vanessa resorted to tracking down her younger sibling. She arrived expecting to find a modest, cramped apartment unit. She expected to encounter a vulnerable pregnant woman she could easily manipulate into providing free lodging and financial salvation. Instead, the visual feed displayed Vanessa staring up at a formidable piece of modern architecture. The 4-unit building radiated an aura of established wealth and impenetrable security. A heavy wrought iron gate barred her access to the reinforced front doors. The disparity between her expectations and the reality of my financial fortress shattered her remaining composure. The camera captured the exact moment Vanessa realized the staggering magnitude of her miscalculation. Driven by a potent combination of desperation and lingering entitlement, Vanessa grabbed the iron bars of the security gate and rattled them forcefully. The heavy metal did not yield. She began to shout my name into the quiet, affluent neighborhood. She demanded entry, her voice echoing off the brick facade. She screamed that she was cold, that she had nowhere else to go, and that family was obligated to provide sanctuary during a crisis. Her erratic behavior was loud, chaotic, and entirely incompatible with the reserved nature of the Queen Anne district. Sitting in the back of the moving vehicle, I experienced another contraction. I gripped the leather armrest, inhaling deeply through my nose and exhaling a slow, measured breath. I watched the frantic figure on my tablet screen. I did not feel the urge to instruct my driver to turn the car around. I did not feel a singular ounce of guilt or obligation. I viewed my sister not as a family member in distress, but as a neutralized threat existing on the wrong side of an unbreakable barrier. I did not engage in a futile dialogue over the two-way audio system. Arguing with a desperate individual only provides them with the emotional friction they crave. Instead, I pressed a single red icon on my security dashboard. The smart home system executed the command instantaneously. A calm, automated voice projected from the exterior speakers mounted above the gate, informing the trespasser that they were occupying private property and that law enforcement was currently en route. Vanessa struck the metal gate one final time with her open palm, but her aggression was swiftly curtailed. My property management firm contracted a dedicated private patrol service to monitor the building. This is a standard layer of protection for premium real estate in this sector of the city. Within 90 seconds of my digital command, a marked security vehicle pulled up to the curb directly behind her. 2 uniformed guards stepped out of the vehicle. They did not entertain Vanessa's hysterical claims of sisterhood or her demands for compassion. They operated on strict property enforcement protocols. The high-resolution feed showed them intercepting her, restricting her movement toward my gate, and steering her firmly back toward the public sidewalk. They detained her with clinical efficiency, neutralizing the disruption before she could even reach my front porch. I closed the application. The screen went dark, severing my final visual connection to the chaotic variables of my biological family. The tension of the physical threat evaporated, neutralized entirely by superior planning and the ruthless application of boundaries. I leaned back against the headrest, directing my full cognitive capacity toward the impending medical procedure. The contrast between my profound internal calm and the external ruin of my sister validated every harsh decision I had made over the past month. Extreme financial independence purchased this exact brand of peace. The transport vehicle navigated the quiet city streets with practiced smoothness, arriving at the premier medical center just as my contractions increased in frequency. The transition from the vehicle to the maternity ward was a seamless logistical exercise. My preemptive registration ensured zero administrative delays at the front desk. Hospital personnel escorted me immediately to a private birthing suite equipped with the latest fetal monitoring technology. The suite provided a sterile, quiet, and highly optimized environment for maternal care. I changed into a hospital gown and established a comfortable position on the adjustable bed. The rhythmic hum of the medical equipment replaced the silence of my townhouse. The physical pain escalated significantly, but I welcomed it as a productive and necessary mechanism to meet my daughter. I monitored the digital readout on the monitor, tracking my own heart rate and the strong, steady heartbeat of my child. An intake nurse entered the suite carrying an electronic tablet. She wore crisp teal scrubs and possessed a warm, professional demeanor. She reviewed my digital medical chart, confirming my vitals, my allergy information, and the specific parameters of my birth plan. She tapped the screen, finalizing the admission process. She looked up from her device, offering a gentle, reassuring smile designed to comfort expectant mothers. "I just need to verify your external support network before we move into the next phase of labor," the nurse said, her voice soft and accommodating. "We have your primary emergency contact listed, but standard protocol requires us to ask about the waiting room registry. Should I go ahead and call the grandparents to let them know the baby is arriving?" The nurse stood beside the adjustable bed, awaiting my response. I looked at her digital tablet and then met her eyes. "No," I replied. My voice remained remarkably calm despite the escalating physiological intensity of labor. "You are not to call them. Furthermore, I need you to update my admission profile immediately. Richard and Diane Sterling are explicitly barred from this facility. If they attempt to bypass the front desk, you are authorized to involve hospital security. They have zero legal or familial access to this room." The nurse did not press for an explanation. Medical professionals in urban centers encounter fractured domestic ecosystems daily. She simply tapped the screen a few times and nodded. "The security protocols are updated," she confirmed. "You are in a restricted status. No one gets through those doors without your direct verbal approval." The hours that followed unfolded with biological predictability. The pain was intense but manageable through focused breathing and epidural intervention. I did not require a frantic audience to validate my experience. I monitored the telemetry data on the screens beside me. The steady rhythm of my child's heartbeat provided the only encouragement I needed. As morning approached, the dark Seattle sky gave way to a crisp dawn. Sunlight spilled over the Cascade Mountains, filtering through the wide windows of the maternity suite and painting the sterile walls in soft hues of gold and amber. At precisely 7:14 in the morning, my daughter entered the world. The delivery room remained serene, governed by the quiet professionalism of the attending physician and the nursing staff. There were no dramatic screams or theatrical fainting spells. There was only the sharp, clear sound of a newborn drawing her first breath. The doctor placed her on my chest. I felt the warm, fragile weight of her tiny body resting against my skin. I looked down at her face, examining the perfect symmetry of her features. This was the profound emotional variable I had anticipated for 9 months. Holding her, I experienced a crystalline realization. The generational cycle of manipulation, guilt, and financial coercion was permanently broken. This child would never serve as a pawn in a suburban status game. She would never be asked to subsidize the reckless mistakes of a favored sibling. Her worth would never be measured by her willingness to surrender her boundaries. I had absorbed the final blows of my parents' toxicity, so my daughter would only ever know a clean slate. My recovery suite did not remain empty, but it was occupied strictly by individuals I had actively chosen. My support network consisted of highly competent peers from the technology sector. Elena, a senior systems architect, arrived bearing artisanal coffee and a box of premium pastries. Marcus, the lead project manager on my development team, brought a highly rated ergonomic infant carrier rather than useless stuffed animals. They sat in the comfortable chairs near the window, speaking in soft, respectful tones. They celebrated my milestone without attempting to center themselves in the narrative. We discussed maternal leave workflows and infant sleep data. The environment was a stark contrast to the traditional chaotic family dramas I had grown up enduring. There were no toxic relatives bursting through the doors, demanding to hold the baby, or issuing backhanded compliments. I was surrounded by a chosen family that valued mutual respect and pragmatic support. While I rested in the sunlit warmth of the hospital, an entirely different reality was finalizing its devastating sequence across Lake Washington. The commercial lending institution did not grant extensions or entertain pleas for leniency. The legal machinery of foreclosure operates with cold efficiency. Richard and Diane were currently standing in the grand foyer of their sprawling suburban home. The space that once hosted elegant country club mixers and projected their flawless social status was now cluttered with cheap cardboard boxes and rolls of packing tape. A rented moving truck sat parked in their circular driveway, a glaring and public symbol of their financial ruin. They were being officially evicted from the property they had foolishly leveraged for their golden child. My father moved through the formal living room, pulling framed artwork off the walls and wrapping the pieces in protective paper. His movements were slow and heavy, stripped of the booming arrogance that defined his entire career. The pristine suits he used to wear were replaced by wrinkled casual clothing. My mother sat on the floor near the fireplace, attempting to sort through decades of accumulated possessions. They had to downsize their entire existence to fit into a modest, short-term rental apartment located far outside their affluent zip code. The silence between them was thick and impenetrable. The bitter arguments had exhausted themselves days ago, leaving only a hollow, shared regret. They were packing their belongings alone. Vanessa was nowhere to be found. When the bank initiated the final asset seizure on the Bellevue waterfront condo, Vanessa realized the influx of capital had permanently dried up. She recognized that our parents possessed no remaining equity to fund her lifestyle. True to her established behavioral algorithm, Vanessa executed her standard exit strategy. She abandoned Richard and Diane just as callously as she had abandoned her own children and her former husband. She stopped answering their phone calls. She blocked their numbers. She vanished into the periphery of the city, likely seeking a new host to subsidize her illusions. My parents had sacrificed their life savings, their home, and their reputation to save a daughter who viewed them merely as a disposable funding source. Now they were reaping the barren harvest of their terrible investment. Back in Seattle, my medical team cleared me for discharge 48 hours after the delivery. I dressed my daughter in a soft, insulated sleeper and secured her into the crash-tested infant car seat. The same premium car service I used for my arrival waited patiently at the hospital entrance. The driver loaded my overnight bag and held the door open. I carried the car seat into the climate-controlled interior, savoring the quiet ride back to my neighborhood. The black sedan pulled into the private alleyway behind my townhouse. The heavy wrought iron gate, the same gate Vanessa had fruitlessly rattled days prior, opened smoothly via proximity sensor. We drove into the secured garage, and the metal barrier closed behind us, sealing us inside my optimized fortress. I carried my daughter through the interior door and into our home. The smart environment recognized my arrival, gradually raising the ambient lighting and adjusting the thermostat to the ideal setting for a newborn. I walked into the kitchen and set the car seat gently on the granite island. The profound peace of the space enveloped me. I had successfully navigated the most vulnerable period of my life without compromising a single boundary. I poured a glass of filtered water and walked over to the integrated smart hub mounted on the wall to review any physical mail deliveries that had accumulated during my hospital stay. My property featured a secure locked mail receptacle designed to prevent tampering. I unlocked the metal box and retrieved a small stack of utility bills, financial statements, and promotional flyers. I sorted through the mundane correspondence, preparing to recycle the unnecessary paper. Near the bottom of the stack, my fingers brushed against a thick, heavy envelope. It lacked standard corporate formatting or printed postage. The paper was slightly textured, indicative of expensive personal stationery. I flipped the envelope over. There was no return address printed in the corner, but the cursive ink scrawled across the center was instantly recognizable. The looping, forceful handwriting belonged unequivocally to Richard. My father had found a way to bypass the digital blockades and the physical security gates. He had resorted to the most archaic form of communication to deliver a message directly into my home. I stood in the quiet kitchen staring at the thick envelope resting in my hand, measuring the physical weight of whatever final manipulation he had chosen to send. I carried the heavy textured envelope to the sprawling quartz island in the center of my kitchen. My daughter slept soundly in the portable smart bassinet, positioned a few feet away. Her breathing formed a soft, rhythmic cadence that anchored the room. I sat on a high-backed leather stool and inspected the stationery. The paper was an expensive cardstock Richard likely hoarded from his corporate consulting days. It was a tangible relic of a defunct empire. I slid a stainless steel letter opener under the sealed flap. The paper yielded with a crisp, tearing sound. I extracted the folded sheet and flattened it against the cool quartz surface. The ink displayed the unmistakable, forceful strokes of my father's handwriting, though the cursive sloped downward, betraying a subtle tremor he could not hide. I read the contents of the correspondence. I did not skim the text. I analyzed it line by line, evaluating the syntactic choices and the underlying psychological framework. Richard did not begin with an inquiry regarding his newborn granddaughter. He bypassed any acknowledgement of my major medical event. He initiated the letter by framing himself as the victim of unforeseeable economic turbulence. He wrote that the commercial lending institution had acted with unprecedented aggression. He claimed the bank forced them out of their home faster than the legal standard permitted, a blatant falsehood designed to elicit sympathy. He detailed their current living arrangement, noting they were residing in a budget motel near the interstate. He specifically described the faded carpets and the noise of the highway traffic attempting to weaponize his own discomfort. He expected the stark contrast between his former country club lifestyle and his current reality to fracture my resolve. Then came the core objective of the communication. Richard did not ask for a handout. His ego prohibited such raw honesty. Instead, he requested a bridge loan. He utilized corporate phrasing to disguise a plea for survival cash. He suggested that a temporary influx of capital would allow him to secure a modest rental property and rebuild his consulting practice. He promised to draft a formal repayment schedule holding competitive interest rates. He attempted to interact with me as a peer in a business transaction, entirely ignoring the reality that he possessed zero collateral and a ruined credit profile. The final paragraph contained his version of an apology. It was a masterpiece of deflection and passive voice. He wrote that he was sorry things got out of hand. He stated he regretted that the situation escalated to such an unfortunate degree. He noted that family must stick together during hard times, implicitly blaming me for fracturing the unit while simultaneously demanding my loyalty. He did not take ownership of stealing my trust fund. He did not apologize for threatening a custody lawsuit. He apologized for the outcome, not the actions that produced it. I sat at the kitchen island and stared at the handwritten page. Standard domestic conditioning dictates that a daughter should feel a surge of guilt upon reading about her parents shivering in a cheap motel. A conventional narrative demands a tearful reconciliation or a furious phone call filled with righteous indignation. I experienced neither. I read the letter with the clinical detachment of a lead researcher reviewing the output log of a failed experiment. The data was predictable. The variables performed exactly as the models forecasted. Richard was deploying obsolete tactics against a system that no longer recognized his input. I felt a profound absence of anger. Anger requires emotional investment. It demands an active tether to the person causing the offense. I had severed that tether weeks ago in Evelyn Reed's office. I looked at the plea for a bridge loan and saw only a line of corrupted code I needed to purge from my server. I did not retrieve a pen to draft a response. I did not pick up my phone to call him and gloat over his misery. Engaging in a final verbal altercation would only provide him with the emotional friction he desperately craved. It would give him a story to tell, a narrative where he was the martyr and I was the cruel victor. True victory requires depriving the antagonist of an audience. I stood up from the stool and carried the letter into my adjacent home office. The room housed my dual-monitor workstation and a high-capacity document scanner. I fed the heavy cardstock into the feeder. The machine whirred to life, capturing a flawless digital replica of his desperate manipulation. I opened my encrypted cloud storage network, navigating to the highly secure directory labeled Documentation. I dragged the digital file into the folder, placing it alongside the audio recordings of his past threats and the verified IP logs of his sabotage. The letter was not a keepsake. It was evidentiary data filed away should he ever attempt to breach my perimeter again. I took the physical sheet of paper and turned toward the commercial-grade crosscut shredder resting beneath my desk. I activated the power switch. The internal blades hummed with latent mechanical energy. I guided the edge of the letter into the narrow slot. The sensor engaged instantly. The shredder pulled the paper downward with ruthless efficiency. The heavy cardstock resisted for a fraction of a second before the interlocking steel teeth destroyed it. The machine rendered his excuses, his corporate buzzwords, and his half-hearted apologies into thousands of illegible confetti strips. The grinding mechanical sound was sharp and definitive. It was the auditory manifestation of a closed ledger. The noise stopped, leaving the room perfectly still. The conflict was over. I walked back to the kitchen and retrieved my tablet from the charging dock. I needed to verify the structural integrity of my own life. I opened my primary financial dashboard utilizing biometric authentication to access the encrypted interface. The screen populated with clean charts and robust figures. I tapped the portal for my real estate holdings. The balance on the primary mortgage for the 4-unit Queen Anne building displayed a perfect 0. The automated rental deposits from the 3 occupied units were scheduled to clear by the end of the business day, generating unencumbered passive income. I navigated to the investment sector of the dashboard. I located the specific 529 education savings plan I established the day my pregnancy was confirmed. The account was fully funded, generating compound interest that would effortlessly cover any university my daughter chose to attend in 18 years. The metrics on the screen confirmed my reality. I had constructed an economic fortress that no erratic family member could dismantle. My daughter would inherit a legacy of autonomy, insulated from the conditional transactions that defined my own upbringing. I opened the carrier settings on my mobile device. I navigated to the restricted contact management protocol. I manually entered the cell phone numbers belonging to Richard and Diane. I added the landline number associated with their defunct Bellevue office. I initiated a network-level block ensuring that any future text messages, voicemails, or incoming calls would be intercepted and discarded before reaching my hardware. I extinguished their access to my digital and physical existence. I set the tablet down on the cool quartz counter. I looked over at the bassinet. My daughter stirred slightly, raising tiny fists before settling back into a deep rhythmic sleep. I stood in the center of my home and listened. There were no incoming text messages demanding my compliance. There were no voicemails threatening my custody rights. There were no unannounced visits from angry relatives trying to breach the front gate. The ambient noise of their toxicity was permanently muted. What remained was a beautiful, unbroken silence. It was the sound of true independence. I left the kitchen and walked through the wide corridors of my home. The hardwood floors felt solid beneath my feet. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the western wall of the living room, framing the towering Washington pines. The evergreens stood rigid against the damp morning mist, dark and unyielding. The Pacific Northwest demands resilience from everything that grows within its borders. The trees survive the bitter winds by growing deep roots rather than broad branches. I stood by the glass and watched the fog roll through the timber. The internal climate of my townhouse remained perfectly calibrated. The thermostat maintained a steady warmth. The air filters hummed a quiet, steady rhythm. The environment belonged to me. I had curated every square inch to reflect order, predictability, and profound security. I spent my childhood navigating a household governed by erratic weather. Richard and Diane operated like a perpetual storm system, generating chaos to keep everyone off balance. I used to believe their methods represented strength. I thought the loudest person in the room held the most authority. Now, gazing out at the silent forest, I understood the true nature of conflict and survival. The greatest weapon my parents possessed was noise. They utilized raised voices, theatrical sobbing, and public shaming as their primary tactics. They deployed guilt trips and performative panic to force compliance. They believed that if they generated enough friction, the surrounding environment would ignite and bend to their will. My victory was achieved through the exact opposite approach. I did not fight fire with fire. I fought fire with a vacuum. I suffocated their manipulation by removing the oxygen they needed to burn. My weapons were silence, meticulous documentation, and the ruthless application of data. When Richard threatened me, I did not shout back. I recorded the interaction. When Diane attempted to weaponize her tears in my corporate lobby, I did not shrink. I signaled security. When they demanded a portion of my wealth to cover their reckless choices, I did not defend my character. I presented a spreadsheet displaying their inevitable ruin. I treated their emotional warfare as a corrupted data set. I quarantined the infected files, secured the perimeter, and let their own unstable algorithms crash their operating system. The fallout of their collapse was swift and comprehensive. Richard and Diane were now permanent residents of the cheap roadside motel they described in their final letter. The commercial lender finalized the foreclosure on their sprawling suburban estate. The property was listed at auction, erasing 3 decades of carefully curated equity. Their social exile was final. The country club elite revoked their memberships and severed all contact. The individuals they once sought to impress now viewed them as toxic liabilities, freezing them out of the only community they valued. They sacrificed their sanctuary, their retirement, and their dignity to maintain a facade that shattered the moment the bank arrived. They were left with nothing but each other, trapped in a cycle of mutual blame inside a cramped rented room near a noisy interstate. Vanessa inherited a different brand of ruin. Her attempt to secure a luxury lifestyle by draining my designated capital ended in catastrophic legal exposure. Chase did not merely take the equity from the Bellevue condominium. He utilized her personal information to authorize fraudulent digital transfers. When the offshore cryptocurrency exchange flagged the suspicious activity, federal authorities initiated an inquiry. Because Vanessa signed the closing documents and granted him unfettered access to the accounts, she became the primary target of the investigation. She was navigating the criminal justice system without a trusted lawyer, facing severe penalties for wire fraud and financial negligence. She abandoned her loyal husband and her innocent children to chase a digital illusion. The illusion evaporated, leaving her to face the harsh machinery of the law alone. Her parents could not afford to bail her out, and she possessed no network of her own. In stark contrast to their sprawling devastation, I stood inside an impenetrable fortress of peace. The daughter they dismissed, the child they labeled cold and administrative, had engineered a reality they could never touch. I possessed a diverse investment portfolio, a lucrative career, and a multi-unit residential property, generating sustainable passive income. I held the deed to my home free and clear. I did not owe a single cent to any lending institution, and I did not owe a single favor to anyone sharing my genetic sequence. My wealth was not a fragile image projected for the benefit of gossiping neighbors. It was a tangible, mathematically verified shield protecting my future. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the kitchen island. My newborn daughter continued to sleep in her bassinet. I leaned over the edge of the sleek resting space, observing the gentle rise and fall of her chest. I reached out and let my index finger brush against her tiny hand. Her fingers curled instinctively around mine, forming a small but profound grip. I looked at her peaceful face and made a silent vow. She would never inherit the generational burden of conditional love. She would never learn to read the shifting moods of unstable adults just to ensure her own safety. I promised her a life free from emotional debt. Her existence would never be leveraged in a negotiation. She would grow up understanding that respect is earned through integrity, not demanded through intimidation. I had absorbed the final tremors of this familial dysfunction so she could build her foundation on solid ground. As I watched her sleep, the overarching philosophy of my journey crystallized into a single defining truth. True power is not a theatrical performance. It does not require a podium, a raised voice, or a dramatic confrontation in a crowded room. People who rely on intimidation broadcast their own profound weakness. They shout because they lack the empirical evidence to command respect quietly. They manipulate because they cannot secure loyalty through genuine connection. They are terrified of silence because silence forces them to hear the echo of their own failures. Real strength requires discipline. It requires the ability to observe a hostile variable without internalizing the threat. It demands the patience to collect the data, analyze the patterns, and anticipate the trajectory of the attack. You do not have to throw a punch to win a war. You just need to know the math. You study the architecture of the abuse, you identify the structural flaws in their logic, and you set the trap using their own arrogance as the bait. Then you step back. You maintain your perimeter. You hold your ground and you let the abusers walk themselves directly into the consequence of their own actions. I stood tall in my kitchen, holding the small hand of my child. The morning sun breached the cloud cover, casting a warm, bright light across the quartz countertops. The shadows of the past retreated, banished by the undeniable clarity of the present. The ledger was closed. The variables were neutralized. The equation was solved. I am Sloane Sterling. I am a mother, a property owner, and a data scientist. I am unbothered, safe, and entirely free.
We build our homes out of wood, stone, and glass, but we build our families out of choices. In the relentless, often breathless pursuit of the American dream, the line between genuine success and fragile illusion can easily blur. We are taught to strive to accumulate and to project an image of unwavering prosperity. Yet beneath the manicured lawns and the closed doors of affluent neighborhoods, a silent ledger is always keeping score. The story of the Sterling family is far more than a simple tragedy of lost real estate or a dramatic legal dispute. It is a profound magnifying mirror held up to the complexities of human nature, revealing the devastating consequences of ego and the quiet, unyielding power of universal truth. When we peel back the layers of this narrative, we find a masterclass in the deeply spiritual architecture of parenting, family responsibility, and the moral compass we hand down to our children. In modern society, particularly in enclaves that worship status and material wealth, there is an immense crushing pressure to appear perfect. Parents burdened by their own unhealed insecurities can easily fall into the trap of using their children as ornaments to decorate their own egos. Richard and Diane Sterling became hopelessly entangled in this illusion. They confused the price tag of their lives with the value of their souls. When their golden child Vanessa stumbled and initiated her own collapse, they could not bear the social embarrassment. Instead of facing the reality of her choices with honesty and courage, they chose to steal from their honest, self-reliant daughter to maintain a hollow facade. They sacrificed the authentic foundation of their family on the altar of public perception. This brings us to one of the most critical lessons in raising children: the distinction between unconditional love and toxic enabling. True parental love is not a shield designed to block every natural consequence from a child's path. When Richard and Diane funneled a stolen inheritance to fund Vanessa's reckless, dependent lifestyle, they believed they were saving her. In truth, they were administering poison dressed as a cure. Compassion without wisdom is merely indulgence. By encouraging a child to live in delusion and rely on the shifting sands of unreliable partners, parents do not protect their children. They push them closer to the edge of the cliff. Furthermore, a healthy family structure requires the profound recognition that children are independent souls, loaned to us by the universe, not resources to be mined. Sloane was treated not as a daughter deserving of fairness, but as a utility, a reservoir of capital and compliance to be drained whenever the parent's preferred narrative required funding. Ethical parenting demands that we honor the autonomy of our children. They are not our property, nor do they owe us toxic debts of gratitude simply for bringing them into the world. When a family operates on extraction rather than mutual respect, it ceases to be a sanctuary and becomes a prison. Sloane viewed her world through the clinical, unsentimental lens of data and predictive modeling. In a deeply philosophical sense, this is the ultimate practice of clarity, the ability to see things exactly as they are, entirely stripped of emotional manipulation and ego-driven illusions. Her spreadsheets and legal contracts were not just tools of defense. They were modern manifestations of the ancient law of cause and effect. The universe is meticulously fair. Every choice is a seed planted in the soil of our lives. Richard and Diane sowed seeds of deceit, arrogance, and theft, assuming their parental title granted them immunity from the harvest. But consequences do not respect titles. They reaped isolation and bankruptcy because that is precisely what they engineered. It is a stark reminder to all parents: every instance of favoritism, every manipulation, and every attempt to force submission will eventually bear fruit. Wisdom lies in recognizing what holds true value. A modest, quiet home secured through integrity, much like the one Sloane built for her newborn daughter, is infinitely richer than a sprawling mansion built on a foundation of lies and unpaid debts. Perhaps the most resonant lesson for modern families lies in the raw, transformative power of silence. We live in a culture that mistakenly equates volume with authority. We are taught to react to conflict with noise, anger, and verbal warfare. Yet the absolute strongest force in the Sterling family saga was Sloane's profound stillness. When faced with theft, manipulation, and the threat of a custody battle, she did not scream. She did not weep. She anchored herself in complete emotional regulation. For parents navigating the turbulent waters of raising children and managing domestic conflict, this is the ultimate test of character. The greatest strength a parent can possess is not the ability to shout a child into submission, but the discipline to master their own ego and remain steady in the face of adversity. The loud, chaotic panic of Richard and Diane was simply a broadcast of their deep internal frailty. When parents cultivate true inner strength, they do not need to rely on the fragile weapons of intimidation or theatrical tears. They lead and teach by the undeniable gravity of their own example. To build a family that lasts, we must possess the courage to look inward. We must stop seeking our own validation through the achievements of our children or the applause of our neighbors. We must willingly relinquish the desperate need to control the narrative, accepting that our children have their own lessons to learn and their own paths to walk. When conflicts arise, we must resist the urge to fill the space with angry noise, choosing instead to step back, analyze the root of the fracture with clear eyes, and respond with transparent, quiet dignity. True happiness does not require a grand podium, a booming reputation, or a portfolio meant only for display. It blossoms in the quiet spaces, in a mind at peace in boundaries respectfully maintained, and in a pure, unselfish love that demands nothing in return. If this journey into the quiet, complex corners of family dynamics resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of truth over noise, please subscribe to Still Drama Stories. We explore the profound, often hidden narratives that shape our lives, and we would be honored to have you walk alongside us in the next chapter. As the screen fades to black on the Sterling family, one question remains lingering in the quiet air. When you strip away the titles, the bank accounts, and the carefully curated images you present to the world, what is actually holding your relationships together? Look closely at the reflection in your own mirror tonight. The cracks you see might just be the exact places where the light is trying to get in, or where the entire foundation is preparing to give way.